All right, what's up, guys? Jay Martin here, investor and CEO of Cambridge House. And my guest today is Richard James, the creator of 3 mini documentaries, one titled Hard Money, one titled The Petrodollar, and one titled Anatomy of the State. And all 3 of these documentaries focus on the concept of sovereignty, personal sovereignty in relation to our government, and how that relationship has shifted over the last 100 years or so. Now, my team found these documentaries, brought them to me and said, you should really watch these. I did, and I had to have Richard on the show. So I'm really glad he made time to come on today. And this is a fascinating discussion. Now, the first 5-10 minutes, we're getting into his background and what he does and all of this. But following that, we got into a very rich discussion about geopolitical power balance and the future of the relationships between mega states and how a digitized currency like Bitcoin may impact those relationships. Now, that may sound like a conversation you've already heard 100 times. Let me just tell you, as a host on one of the YouTube channels or podcasts you might listen to, this was maybe the most refreshing and insightful conversation that I've had on this topic. So I'd encourage you to check it out, because honestly, when I wrap up these conversations, sometimes I know that they're better than others. And I felt like this one was better than others. So let me know in the comments if I'm way out to lunch on that, or you feel the same way, because I was able to get a lot of my biggest questions about, I see a lot of challenges with Bitcoin adoption in the future. And you know, Richard did a great job at, I think, providing very pragmatic, realistic answers that were separate from the too frequent dogmatic responses I get from Bitcoin advocates. Okay, so take that for what it is. I hope you enjoy this. 3 things before we jump into this interview. Number 1, right beneath this video, there's a pinned comment where you can subscribe to my weekly newsletter if you want to do so. I publish every week and it's free. I'd love to have you join the team. Number 2, this YouTube channel now generates a significant amount of advertising revenue, which is awesome and honestly unexpected. So what I've decided to do with this cash is donate it to an organization that is super close to my heart called Zero Ceiling. Zero Ceiling's mission is to end youth homelessness. The way they do this is by giving at-risk urban youth the opportunity to relocate to beautiful wilderness areas and then provide them with supportive housing, career training, and just positive influences on their life. I am somebody who at a young age went down the wrong path, was rescued by my experiences in the natural world, and I understand how therapeutic the natural world can be. So I love what Zero Ceiling does. Number 3, if you prefer to listen to my content as opposed to watch it, you can now find me wherever you listen to your podcast. Just search for The Jay Martin Show. Here's my conversation with Richard James. Enjoy. I assemble the smartest people I can think of or reach out to carry that conversation, and that's exactly what I've done today. Please give my panel a round of applause. Welcome. Okay, guys, Jay Martin here, investor and CEO of Cambridge House, and I'm joined right now by Richard James, independent film producer. Richard, it's great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Jay.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to it. You know, it's funny how I came to learn about you, because, you know, we do these interviews here on the YouTube channel and we focus on like financial sovereignty and, you know, the sovereign mindset is kind of what I call it, right? Not necessarily opting out, but just understanding the significance and importance of learning how to take care of yourself to a point of being reliant on nobody but yourself. I think that's the best thing you can do for your community at large. We were looking at doing some sort of mini documentaries on a couple topics that keep on coming up in the interviews, and my team found your stuff and they thought, well, they told me you got to check out Richard James's films. And so I've now watched 3 of your films, and I've seen Hard Money, Petrodollars, and Anatomy of the State. And they're very well done. And I enjoyed them all, and I highly recommend all 3. And I thought I got to get this guy on the show and just chat. So here we are.
Thanks very much. I'm glad to hear you've seen all those, and you know, it's something that, you know, I've been focusing more on in the last couple of years. You know, I'm actually not necessarily I trained in filmmaking, many years ago, but sort of my career took a sort of different path, and I didn't work in that. You know, I've never really worked in film in a professional capacity. I've got I do have the day job, which is running a business in the travel industry, which has been a bit slow lately. So it's been great to, have more time at home and explore filmmaking a bit in a different way. You know, the one thing that the thing that makes those projects stand apart from anything else I've done, and hopefully makes them a bit unique, is that they were all just made from material that I already found on the internet. Like, I'd pieced them together from podcasts, interviews, clips I found on YouTube. It's kind of so they're all made with just me on my computer without a budget, just putting material together in that way. So it's been an interesting way to go about making films, and it seems to be working well.
Yeah, well, they're highly educational and entertaining, and I feel like you have to tick both those boxes, right? You can be as educational as anything, but if people don't enjoy the content, they're not going to stick to it. They won't watch it in its entirety. They won't watch the next episode, and therefore they won't actually learn what you're trying to offer. But you do a great job of telling a story in a way that you want to watch, but it's also, I think, very important information for anyone who hasn't seen any Hard Money, Petrodollars, or Anatomy of the State. Can you give us, Richard, like the highest level overview of what the theme is behind the films you create?
Sure. They sort of work. The three films kind of work as a bit of a trilogy, in that they all come back to the same general topics, which is about the nature of the state, that is the government, or the monopolist on violence in any particular territory, basically, and money. Those are the two themes that the films always come back to, and what is money, and how money is used by the state to achieve its goals. So and so that's why Anatomy of the State probably is the foundation, which gives it's based on the book by Murray Rothbard, who's an Austrian school economist and a libertarian, an anarchist, basically. He gives this outline of what is the state, and why he thinks it's an institution that's actually opposed to liberty, the liberty and sovereignty of the individual. It takes a very skeptical view of the position of government in society, and so everything kind of flows from there. And money, hard money, builds on that by really looking at asking that question of what is money, and specifically looking at the phenomenon of inflation, and how governments use inflation as a hidden tax and as a means to gain revenue and grow. And then Petrodollars is kind of building on that again and going into a specific case, which is the way the United States kind of entered into this deal with Saudi Arabia to price oil in dollars, and this sort of secret deal allowed the US to prolong the hegemony of the US dollar for another several decades, and some of the negative externalities of that arrangement. So that's sort of summarizing the topics in the broadest terms.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Actually, I don't know, when did you produce these, Richard?
Actually, Hard Money was the first one I did. That was last year, around June, I think. And then Anatomy of the State sometime later, and then Petrodollars was earlier this year, a couple of months ago. So the good thing about the style of film, and they're not long films. They're each one's about half an hour, and I actually find that that seems to be working really well as a narrative formula. That it's a good amount of time that someone can. It's enough time to go into depth on a topic, but someone can sit down and watch it in half an hour. It's not an intimidating amount of time like, your standard documentary, which might be an hour and a half or an hour 45. But because the material's already there, I don't have to travel or it's sort of a quicker process of filmmaking. Like I can turn a film around much faster than if you followed the traditional process.
Okay, right. So were these quarantine projects, Richard?
Yeah, exactly. That's how the first one started.
I love that.
We went into lockdown here in Melbourne, and couldn't really leave the house, couldn't go to work, stuck at home. So that it was it definitely started as a quarantine project.
I love that. I love that way to use the time to create. Man, it's the best. Okay, now the message is real consistent and pretty thick, with I guess forcing the viewer to place questions on what is sovereignty and how is it threatened. That's kind of my general takeaways. So I got to ask you, like, what inspired? Because you said your side business or maybe your core business is a travel business. So, what inspired you to create this message and this content?
Well, I sort of went on a journey a few years ago. I'm in the travel industry. I've had to shift gears a little bit. I'm interested in. I've always loved to travel, but I'm interested in starting businesses and entrepreneurship. That's something I've been working on, over the past decade or so. But I started on this journey of, first of all, it was a very simple idea of trying to figure out how to invest my savings and preserve wealth for me and my family. And, so I was kind of learning about investing and I read Warren Buffett's letters and learned about value investing and that's sort of that. I had that journey. But then in parallel, I was also, I'd always had an interest in economics. I studied economics at school and university and was fascinated by it, but was always frustrated by the way it was taught. It never really made sense to me, or there was something missing, I felt, in the way that it was taught. And so I came, both those roads kind of met with each other when I became interested in the Austrian school of economics. And that was something that I'd never come across in all my years of formal study. And it really presented a different way of looking at economics, but looking at the world in general that really resonated with me, which was starting at first principles, to take really making you examine what are your assumptions. Whenever you're having an argument, you have to go back to first principles and make sure that you understand the terms, you understand the definitions, you understand what you're assuming is given. And the Austrian school goes back and says, we're going to start with the most basic premise that we can, which is something like humans act, something that can't really be refuted. And we're going to build a logical system based on that, which was a different way of looking at things than the economics that I learned in school, which I think dived in at this place that didn't make sense to me. On the first page of the textbook was something like, here's the business cycle. Economies go in this cycle of boom and bust, and it's the role of government is to intervene and smooth out the business cycle. And that was sort of literally the first page of the textbook. And so it was taken as given that there was a business cycle, and it was taken as it didn't sort of explain why that existed. And it was also taken as given that it was the role of government to intervene and, that this business cycle, that the market economy was inherently flawed somehow. And so the reason I found the Austrian school of economics so fascinating was that it took us several steps backward and actually was able to explain some of these phenomena from first principles. And actually, it made me realize that the government was in fact the more likely to be the cause of some of these problems than actually the solution. So that got me interested in there's a scholar by the name of Murray Rothbard who we mentioned, who that film Anatomy of the State is based on. He works in the field of economics, but he also does work in the field of ethics. He's a libertarian, but he uses this same methodology, this same way of thinking of deductive reasoning from first principles to lay out a system of ethics that I find fascinating. And so I think the world of economics, which is a value-free science, and the world of ethics, which is not, which is saying, these are certain values, things like freedom, individual sovereignty, why they're important. Those two things come together in that Austrian school's way of thinking. And so I suppose the other thing is, both those roads have led me to a real interest in Bitcoin. And in the films don't, none of them are specifically discussions of Bitcoin, but they're all, I guess, the road leads to Bitcoin as the best solution to the problems that I put forward in the films, basically.
Interesting. Okay, I want to back up for a second. Why do you think? Okay, first of all, I shouldn't ask that. Let's get back to first principles on your cue here. So I want to ask, why do you think? Do you think that libertarianism and the idea of personal sovereignty is often perceived as insensitive or selfish, self-serving? Do you ever get that response to terms like that?
Yes, absolutely.
Why do you think that is?
It is the first reaction, when you hear something like, when you try and discuss libertarianism, that it's, that individualism is selfish. And I think there's this issue where, it's our current way of organizing society, which is basically social democracy, the method of government that we have in Canada, in Australia, in the United States, is based on this idea that as a community, we can come together and help each other and solve problems that we wouldn't be able to solve ourselves. And that sounds great as a when you first hear that, it sounds really good, but there are some, I think, inherent flaws in that argument. That if you go back to first principles and talk about the individual and agency and sovereignty and why, the needs of the individual have to come first and foremost if we're going to discuss the flourishing of human civilization, that's the most logical way to proceed. But unfortunately, it's not necessarily the argument that appeals to emotion. And I think that's why sort of ideas about communal living or socialism, persist so strongly, over the course of the last century or two, because there is a certain emotional appeal to that line of argument.
Yeah, it's a challenge for me, and I feel this drive to I don't want to say challenge that idea, but maybe define it a little bit, because I agree with you. As a community, we come together and we can solve issues as long as individually we arrive at that community with resources to contribute, right? Coming together is not enough. It just isn't, right? And, it brings me back to parenting. Like, I know you're a father, as am I. We both have 3 young kids. And I know I can be a great dad or a very, very poor dad. And that's dependent on a couple of things. Namely, how much energy I have left in the tank when I get home, right? And so if I've taken care of myself, if my health is good, if I slept well, if my nutrition is good, if I've managed all of that stuff, when I show up at home, I've taken care of myself first, then I can be a great dad, leave a positive impression on my kids. I can be patient, right? I've got the resources within me to be a great parent, right? And set a good example and lead with patience and compassion. Whereas if I show up, my tank's on empty and I'm exhausted and I ate horrible food and I feel like crap, that's going to be reflected in what I give to my community, right? My immediate community, my friends, my family. And that analogy is so clear to me. Does that resonate with you? Because when I think about it like that, like as a father, I got to take care of myself to take care of anybody else. I got to take care of myself to be a better husband, right? If I'm in a bad place, everybody around me is impacted negatively, right? But I got to show up with something to give.
Yes, that does resonate with me. And, when I think of that analogy, I can move it over into this field of economics, which is that the free market or capitalism in general gets a bad rap. But I think that's, you talked about the energy, that's almost like where the energy comes from in human civilization. It really does come down to our ability to build capital. If you think about this humanity in its natural state, humans, the only way humans survive and flourish is to somehow transform the natural environment that they're put into, in ways that allow them to grow their wealth, and everything else follows from that. It's that process of capital accumulation, production, and trade that builds all the wealth that we have in society, and government is necessarily follows from that. Government can't create wealth. It simply can't. All it can do is take wealth from those that have already created it, and you potentially put that to some other use. And some would say perhaps to a greater good. But I think that the problem is that the government, governments. That's I think the main issue here, which is that the government can only take. It can't create anything from nothing. It has to use the energy that's already been created by the free market. And unfortunately, we have this process where it seems inevitably that it grows and grows to the point where it consumes all of the energy and has nothing left.
Now, that seems to me like the trajectory that we're on. I mean, all my viewers are going to agree, government's expanding, right? Therefore, the reliance of the population is growing. The reliance on government is growing, right? Especially through the last 18 months. And in some cases, there's been some, I think that out of necessity, right? But not always. And so do you see that trend occurring right now, Richard? Does it concern you? Where do you think it goes eventually? What does that look like?
Yes, I agree that I think that's the trend we're going in. And I think that, in some ways there's an inevitability to that. It's a trend that I think's been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. And if you look back, and I think it's something that's inherent to the nature of the state, to whoever has the monopoly on violence. If you go back to the founding of the United States, which was founded on these principles of freedom and a real desire to limit the exercise of government power through the Constitution. I think you can sort of almost look at the history of, say, the United States as the slow growth of government from where it started as this experiment in extreme limited government to where we are now, where the government consumes such a huge section of society and economy, and that's happening here where I live. It's happening all over the world, and I think will continue to happen in the short term. Something that informs my thinking on this is a book called The Sovereign Individual, which sort of lays out this this thesis about how the world works. It was written back in the late 1990s, and it talks about how human organization and the way we organize our societies is basically a response to what they call the return on violence, which is kind of sounds, it sounds like an esoteric kind of thing, but basically they're saying that, if you go back to when humans were, say, hunter-gatherers, there wasn't much to be gained by being violent, basically, because the humans hadn't stored up any wealth to steal. But once we had the agricultural revolution, say, and we started to accumulate capital and we settled into villages and towns, humans started to build wealth. And so as a human, you've got two choices. One is to peacefully engage in production and exchange, or there's another, we all have free will, and there's another option available to us, which is to simply take what someone else has already created. And but that there's always a trade-off. Like there's risks involved in that process, but we've seen this general trend over the course of human civilization, tied to basically the advancement and proliferation of weapons technology, that the return, the gain to projecting violence has been increasing, and to the point where fast forward to the 20th century and you get the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and we're now seeing, the existence of states, governments on a scale vastly larger than we'd ever seen before in human history. Obviously it ebbs and flows, but if you look at the middle of the 20th century, where you had the United States, you had the Soviet Union, you've got government, the world split up into a very small number of large states, and the argument in the sovereign individual is that's basically a reaction to this logic of violence, and that the states are going to sort of continue to grow. But what's interesting is that there's this opposing force that's sort of popped up in recent years, which is basically information technology. And they talk about the advance of computers and information technology as this revolution in the logic of violence, where all of a sudden assets like human wealth, for all of human history, wealth has been stored in physical form, whether that's gold or whether it's a farm plot, or whether it's, in the 20th century, we saw that the scale of these physical assets grow to a point where, it might be a huge factory with production lines, and that presented itself as a target for state capture. But all of a sudden, with the onset of computers and software, wealth is no longer necessarily in physical form. All of a sudden it's digital, and that means it's much easier to defend that wealth and move that wealth. And governments, the growth of governments has always been predicated on control of the physical realm, of physical wealth. But all of a sudden, if wealth becomes digital and it can move, and the first revolution we've seen is in software. And what's interesting is the next potential revolution is in the digitization of wealth in money, which was predicted in this book in the late 90s, before Bitcoin and before the advent of cryptographic money. That's this other force that makes wealth so much more mobile, so much easier to defend. And so their thesis is that, if you look forward for the next just several generations, while states are growing now, you're potentially going to see a revolution where, that states won't be able to capture that wealth as effectively. And so we may, in fact, be moving towards a future where state power is declining, and the way governments are forced to organize on a smaller scale. And you may see more of a relationship between citizens and governments, like a consumer and a business. Like the governments are forced to sort of serve their citizens more like a business and compete for citizens, because wealth is now so mobile. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's if that plays out, I think it will be a force for good in the world, for freedom and sovereignty. But unfortunately, possibly in the short term, you're going to see, states use everything within their means, to try and, extract as much wealth as they can, whilst this kind of battle is going on.
Well, this is still the game. Okay. And so I want to pull on some threads there and get into really what you're explaining could create that transition, which, as I understood, as you explained it, is, true mainstream and widespread adoption of a competitive world reserve currency that could be Bitcoin or something similar. And, we've moved from a place, at least in the United States, you mentioned the American experiment and the Constitution, which was written in such a way that really it was built to limit the power of the president. That's why actually the president's far less powerful than a prime minister of Canada, for example, relative. And that's by design. That was the beauty of the American experiment. Let's limit the power of any one individual, right? Limit the power of government. We've transitioned to a place where government's not following the people. People are now following the government, and to transition back to a place where people hold the power. We need to now. I struggle with that a little bit, and here's why. We're driven by narratives, and we're driven by stories, right? And the stories are told to us by media platforms. And just in the last 8 years since the 2016 election, a lot of us realized how powerful social media platforms and media narratives can really drive population sentiment towards major decisions, right? i.e., a national election. And so there's a third party here, right? There's the people, there's the government, and then there's maybe call the digital states, right? And the rise of the digital states, I would call, it's Twitter, it's Facebook, Instagram, it's, these tech empires that control the information that all of us consume, that are sitting on treasuries competitive with any sovereign nation. And their power, I think, is still not quite understood. And I don't know if there's a question on the back of that, Richard, but how does that player fit into this narrative? And I want you to elaborate a little bit on how you could see the transition occurring where enough people adopt a competitive world currency to actually shift the tide of power. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a really interesting, way to look at things. And I agree and understand that there are concerns, let's say, about the
and just
the
to be
growth
clear,
of some
I
of these
hope I'm wrong on that, but it's just what I see.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I guess my take on it is that I still, perhaps we can. There is a conversation to be had about the growth of big tech, and whether it's a good or a bad thing. And you're certainly seeing governments attempt to limit the power of these tech companies in some ways and regulate them. But I still see this fundamental difference between these entities, which is that, even though a platform like Google or Twitter, is increasingly becoming powerful, I as an individual I still have the option to walk away and not use those platforms if I don't want to. I'm not in any way forced to use them. I might choose to do so, and I may not fully understand the trade-offs involved in using them in terms of data collection or the way they manipulate, the way our brains work and addiction and things like that. But at the fundamental level, it's an optional interaction. Whereas the problem I have with government is that it's not optional. I don't have the option to walk away, from this social contract that exists with the government if I'm not happy with it. So, I think that needs to be taken into account when people try and invoke government as the savior to the way the world is going with big tech. The other interesting phenomenon that is possibly playing out is the fact that for several hundred years, possibly since the introduction of central banking, going back to the 1600s or 1700s, you've seen this real kind of partnership between the state and banking. That's been a really important partnership, and that's sort of where the way I view central banking is kind of a way for it's a way for governments to sort of monetize debt and increase their rate of growth, and it's also good for the banking system as a backstop, and that allows them to continually expand the money supply. But what you may be seeing is a shift in that partnership between government and banking towards more government and big tech, like especially with all this talk of central bank digital currencies. I find that a really interesting phenomenon that there may be sort of a new alliance forming between governments and these organizations. That is certainly a cause for concern. You often find that once certain industries become really large, they sort of become married to the state and have use regulatory capture to sort of entrench their monopoly and shield themselves from the force of the market. So that is a cause for concern. It's not something I'm an expert in, but it's an interesting thing to ponder.
Yeah, and I love the idea of opting out of big tech. I really struggle to see how I could do that. And let me explain. It's not, well, there's a host of reasons, but I think as a business owner, take me back to the 1980s. Can I operate my business without a physical address and a phone line? Like, probably not, right? It will be very challenging, right? And today we exist online. And so how can you operate your business? How can you generate wealth and improve your status in life without opting in to the world we live in, which is very much digital, and there aren't competitors when it comes to what Twitter offers, what Facebook, Instagram offer? Not really, and can it's hard to, you talked about government regulating big tech, and I think it's got to go that direction. I don't know that's a great thing, but I just think these companies are likely eventually to be regulated like utilities, because very much that's what they've become, right? Small, medium business is reliant upon that digital presence. And how do you have that? Well, you have to use one of the monopoly platforms that exists, right? And opting out of that, sure, you could try, but it's hard, right? It's very hard to adopt a customer base, grow your presence, gain traction with a product or service, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I love the romantic idea, but I struggle to actually visualize how I could adopt that. Do you think I'm missing something, Richard, or what do you think about that?
No, I don't think you're missing anything at all. I think it's a legitimate concern. I suppose the only thing I can say is that my own personal concern about the way the world is moving, is not necessarily with big tech. It's with government, really. I think it's an interesting conversation about big tech and opting out, and it's something that I've been interested in looking at personally, just because it's something I'm interested in terms of, can I do without Google? Are there ways to use open source software competitors where I don't have to give up my data? Or, to be honest, I'd rather just have an open contract where I pay to use services that I find valuable, like email or maps, where I know that I'm just paying for the service and I'm not giving up data or privacy in ways that I don't understand. I certainly think that's a concern and a big conversation to be had in society. I suppose that it's just that my default response is always that I believe that government will do more harm than good. Like, that's just a blanket statement that I apply to everything almost, is that I believe the answer is always less regulation than more regulation. I don't have, when it comes to something like a natural monopoly, whether that's in cyberspace or in physical assets, utilities or whatever. I just believe that, if the free market was left to its own devices, competition would work. And I find that when you see a monopoly, I just believe that there's more chance that it's because there's been some inherent privilege granted by the state than some inherent property of that actual market.
Okay guys, 3 last things. First, if you enjoy my interviews and would like a bit more, you can subscribe to my Friday newsletter. It's free, and the comment to subscribe is right beneath this video in that pinned comment. In this newsletter, I share my key lessons learned, takeaways, and any actions that I might be taking in the market as a consequence of what I've learned on the show. Second, when I started a YouTube channel, I never anticipated generating any advertising revenue. But coincidentally, I do now, which is awesome. And so what I've decided to do is donate this to an organization that is very close to my heart called Zero Ceiling. Their mission is to end youth homelessness. The way they do this is by providing young people experiencing homelessness with supportive housing, employment, professional support, life skills, and outdoor adventure. Because often young people in urban centers with no resources will never get the opportunity to experience wild places, nature that can be so transformational, and absolutely was for me. Third, if you prefer to listen to my content, you can now find us wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for The J Martin Show.